If you ever take a look at the Darkest Dungeon 2 character portraits, you'll notice they all gaze downcast into the dark, burdened by the weight of their shame. That is, except one. Hello everyone. The Chad King returns to us again in Darkest Dungeon 2. As one of my favorite characters in the series, I'd like to give my opinions on the Leper class in DD2 as of the November patch. We'll be taking a look at his strengths, weaknesses, all of his abilities, and some synergies. A quick disclaimer, this guide will contain spoilers referencing locations and enemies, and obviously Leper's abilities. Let's take a look at his stats. Here I've made a chart showing all 8 characters in Darkest Dungeon with their base stats. The average is on the right here, and then a ranking key to add some color to give us an idea at a glance of how the stats compare between the characters. Leper's on the far left here. His max HP is the second highest in the game, just 1 point below Man-at-Arms. His speed is tied with him for the lowest, and his bleed, blight, and burn resist are all the worst in the game, while his disease and debuff are average, and stun and move resist are a bit above average. His strength, in this case, is his stun and move resist, keeping him in the front, with a strong max HP to make himself reliable. However, his bleed, blight, and burn are quite problematic, as lots of enemies use DOTs in this game, especially with the added DOT of burn. This will give us an idea of how we will choose to use his abilities, equip trinkets, and of course, which combat items to use. With all of that in mind, let's take a look at his abilities. Before looking at Leper's abilities, it is worth noting that he has a sort of passive or innate ability, where at the start of every combat there is a 75% chance he gains a blind token, and another 25% chance that he gains a blind token as well. These can both hit, meaning he can start combat with 2 blind tokens, he can start with 1, or if they both miss, he would have none at all. This is very important as we consider the rest of his kit and play around this obvious weakness. Leper's first ability is Chop, usable in the front 2 ranks to hit the enemy front 2 ranks, with a damage of 6 to 12 and a fairly standard crit of 5%, worth noting that this damage is fairly high as far as damaging moves are concerned, making him a solid damage dealer late game. And of course, with the downside of a 75% chance upon using that he applies a blind token to himself. When upgraded, the damage range increases to 6 to 16, and also adds the effect of when the Leper targets an enemy with a combo token, he ignores the miss chance of his own blind. Effectively meaning, assuming an enemy doesn't have a dodge token, if you hit somebody with combo using this, it will always hit. As well, it lowers the chance of him applying a self-blind from 75 down to 60%. This is the bread and butter attack move. It is incredibly weak early due to the self-blinds, but it is quite strong once upgraded and you get combo tokens reliably from other characters. Once you're able to get to this stage, he can transition from being, as I would argue, a tank first into a damage dealer second. This usually will occur after your second or third in, depending on how many mastery points you pick up, as well as what other characters you choose to bring along. I will be covering his synergies later. Early game, you definitely don't want to be spamming this move without something like Milk Soak Linen or other ways to cleanse his blind, as his abilities to tank using Withstand, Intimidate, and Solemnity are much more reliable. Leper's second ability is Purge, usable from the front rank to hit the enemy front rank, dealing 2 to 4 damage, standard crit of 5, and also against the target it knocks back 3 unless they resist, and it clears corpses from the target team. When upgraded, the damage goes up to 3 to 5, and also it applies a combo token to the enemy hit. This is a great situational utility move. Clearing corpses is very important in the feeder to avoid enemies using their corpulent abilities, where they eat a corpse and then gain a powerful move. And this move does that very well. It is important to note that even if you miss, corpses will still clear, making this at the same time useful to remove a blind token from him. As far as knocking enemies back, I don't think in most cases that is too particularly useful, except as a way to send the Sacrificial Fanatic, for example, to the back if he gets to the front. And it can also help shuffle the Librarian boss up to the front by sending the book stacks to the back, as of now their move resist is fairly low. So the move is definitely worth playing around with, but not something you'll use too much. Some enemies also have, a lot of like weaker melee enemies have a weak ability when they're in the 4th rank, but they use a standard ability when in the front 3, so that's worth mentioning also. Leper's 3rd ability is Withstand, usable in the front 3 ranks. It has a cooldown of 3 turns with 2 uses per battle. It applies 2 block tokens, 2 taunt tokens. You get a 15% resist and bleed, blight, burn, and move resists. And at the start of a turn, for his next 3 turns, he gains another block token. This upgrades to giving him 2 block token plus, which instead of 50% resist when hit, it's 75% resist. The 4 resists increase to 25%, up from the 15. And at the turn start, for the next 3 turns, he still applies the regular block token. This is without a doubt Leper's most consistently best performing ability, considering its relevancy at all stages of the game, so I'm going to argue. On top of adding notable resistances in nearly every category, as we looked at earlier, a lot of his DOT resists are the worst in the game here, so this improves those by quite a bit. Also considering Leper's massive HP pool and his ability to easily stress heal himself, as we'll look at later, makes him a prime tanking target to take enemy hits the entire combat. This is oftentimes, I find, his best opening move, even later in the game. Leper's 4th ability is Solemnity, usable in the front 2 ranks, has 2 uses per combat, and to himself, if he has less than 33% max HP, he'll heal 33% of his maximum HP, and he also reduces his stress by 2. Note that unlike other healing abilities, this can be used even if he isn't below the healing threshold to immediately do the stress heal portion. When this upgrades, it heals 50% instead of 33%, and it reduces his stress by 3 instead of 2. This move acts fundamentally the same as in Darkest Dungeon 1, of course relative to how much weaker healing both for health and stress is in this game. The fact that you can use this move to stress heal even without your health being low makes this great for stalling, and it is another reason why he is such a powerful tank. With this ability and Withstand, Leper rarely should go to death's door or even have a meltdown, unless things go terribly wrong, of course. Leper's 5th ability is Reflection, usable in the front 2 ranks with a 1-turn cooldown. It removes 1 stress, removes all of his blind tokens, and removes a combo token. When upgraded, the stress heal goes up to 2, and it gives him a 20% debuff resist for 3 turns. This is useful, however, I'd argue situational, and I'd argue this move looks a lot better than it actually is. The ability isn't bad, don't get me wrong, but the problem is that in most cases, there's just a better button to press, in my experience. If you're looking to stall or stress heal, Solemnity will always do a point more, and if you want to remove a blind token, it's probably better just to Intimidate. The move we'll be covering later. However, it's worth noting that it does remove up to 2 blind tokens, in which case it's great if you get unlucky with his blind rules upon entering combat. I consider the fact this removes combo to be irrelevant, if not actually in a way detrimental, as you actually want to be tanking and taking hits as Leper. However, I might be wrong, as besides the finishing blow from Pillagers, I'm unsure what other enemies use combo. Regardless, I still generally will run this move and use it in those edge cases, such as the aforementioned double blind tokens, or if I want to stress heal and Solemnity happens to be on cooldown. Leper's 6th ability is Hew, usable in the front 2 ranks. It cleaves the enemy front 2 ranks, meaning it does a separate damage roll and crit roll for each of those enemies, dealing 3 to 7 damage with a crit chance of 5%. And then, similar to Chop, it has a 75% chance after using of applying a blind token to himself. When upgraded, the damage increases from 4 to 9, and similar to Chop as well, with upgrade, he ignores his own chance of missing from blind when the target is comboed, as well as lowering the chance from 75 down to 60% that he reapplies a blind token to himself. This move is fairly bad in most situations, I'd argue, as it suffers from competing with Chop, which I'd say is better in at least 90% of situations. Not to mention, you probably don't want to spend the Mastery in order to upgrade this in order to make it more consistent, as you'd rather upgrade Chop instead. Sure, you could argue this move overall does more damage than Chop, assuming the cleave is hitting both enemies. However, it's always better to kill one enemy quickly than 2 enemies slowly, considering action economy is everything, especially considering how many times the front rank enemy may end up taking multiple spots and Hew won't do any bonus damage anyways, as it'll only hit one target. The only real redeeming quality of this move, I would say, is that it's a way for him to token shred or remove a token off multiple enemies like block or dodge. However, there are generally better ways to do that in the fights where you'd want it, considering you build a good comp around him. Overall, I'd consider this to be one of his worst moves, as it tries to compete for the absolute glory that is Chop. Leper's 7th ability is Revenge, usable in any rank with a cooldown of 3 turns and 2 total uses per combat. He applies 2 vulnerable tokens to himself, and at the start of a turn, for his next 3 turns, you get a Strength token. Once upgraded, he gets only 1 vulnerable token instead of 2. He removes any weak tokens he might have, and at the start of the next 3 turns, in addition to the Strength token, there's a 15% chance he also gains a crit token. This move is incredibly useful as a boss killing move, but besides that, I'd argue it's too slow in most cases. This ability contends with Ruin, as they both serve a similar function of giving scaling damage for killing bosses. I can't say for sure which one is better, but it is worth noting that Revenge is more consistent, whereas Ruin has a higher possible output of damage. I'll talk about this a bit more when we look at Ruin. Leper's 8th ability is Intimidate, usable in rank 1, hits any rank from the enemy. It deals 1 to 2 damage, standard crit of 5. He applies 2 taunt tokens to himself, and if he hits the target, they gain 2 weak tokens, assuming they don't resist the debuff. When upgraded, the damage goes up to a range of 2 to 3, and it ignores the enemy's stealth if they have it, so he can target enemies with stealth, and it removes their stealth. Do not underestimate this ability due to its fact that it has piss poor damage numbers, as that is overlooking how incredibly good this move is. As Withstand has a 3-turn cooldown, this is an effective way to get taunt tokens back up. In addition, it's a great way to shred a blind token off of himself, as Leper still gains the taunt tokens regardless of whether or not the move hits. The fact that it can weaken a high damaging enemy is a huge plus as well. I cannot stress enough how good this move is, despite how weak it might appear, and it's the main reason why I'd argue that Leper should always be in rank 1, along with giving him the option to use Purge, as it similarly requires him to be in rank 1. Leper's 9th ability is Ruin, usable in the front 3 ranks. It has a 3-turn cooldown with 2 uses per combat. It gives himself a buff lasting for 3 turns that whenever he takes a damage, he gains a 20% damage increase, and this stacks additively every time he takes damage. Worth noting that when the buff disappears in 3 turns, he also loses this damage bonus. When upgraded, he gives himself a 2/3 bleed, meaning that at the start of the turn, bleed will tick, guaranteeing that ruin procs. As mentioned earlier with Revenge, this contends with it as a boss-killing ability, as it's too slow in most other fights. As Leper has plenty of ways to tank and guarantee that he is targeted with taunt tokens, you can expect this to get stacked up quite high. The issue, however, is how finicky the 3-turn duration is. If you open a fight with Withstand, the taunt tokens will likely go away before you can use Ruin on turn 2. But if you use Ruin first on turn 1, you will either want to follow up with either Intimidate, potentially benefiting from some of the damage increase, or using Withstand to get his taunt token going. But either way, you essentially lose a turn of being able to benefit from the damage, as you'll want to taunt with him. If you get into a situation where you effectively lose another turn due to him being stunned, him being shuffled out of position, your combo token generator person being stunned or shuffled as well, if you don't have Milk Soak Linen or another way to cleanse his blind, you're effectively losing another turn of him being able to benefit from the damage. The fact that there's so many ways this ability can effectively go wrong by expiring too quickly before you can make use of the damage makes me think that Revenge is a more consistent option, as it gives him tokens that each have their own expiration time of 3 turns individually. The fact that there's essentially all these ways that it can go wrong makes me think that Revenge is the better move to use. I could be wrong though, and this might be a lot better than I give it credit for. I haven't played around with it enough, but overall, I do think Revenge is a bit more consistent, and I'm inclined to use it more. Leper's 10th ability is Break. Usable in the front 2 ranks, hits an enemy in either the front 2 ranks, deals 4 to 7 damage with a crit of 5%. It ignores block tokens, and it removes block tokens from the enemy that he hits. It also, similar to Chop and Hew, gives him a 75% chance of applying a blind token to himself. When upgraded, the damage increase range goes up to 4 to 10 damage, and similar to the Chop and Hew upgrades, it ignores blind when the target is comboed, and then lowers the chance of reapplying a blind down to 60% from the 75. This suffers for the same reasons I mentioned earlier that Hew does, which is that it contends with Chop as both an ability to use for damage and an ability to master in order to start making the move more consistent. The obvious application for this ability is that versus Chop, I believe it'll pretty much always do more damage against enemies that have block, as well as providing the utility of being able to remove block from the enemy. I did have a good run where I used this and upgraded it, and I effectively didn't even run Chop. I just run this in the Tangle, where a lot of those Bone Soldier fodder all have 2 block tokens, so this is able to remove both of them, and it did perform quite well. However, considering that as of now no boss enemies have block tokens, and none of the cultists do, it ends up feeling like a wasted mastery sync, as Chop will perform this move in every other situation where block tokens are not there. So it's something worth playing around with, but overall I don't think it's too worth upgrading. Leper's 11th and final ability is Bash. Usable in the front 2 ranks, hits either of the front 2 ranking enemies, deals 2 to 4 damage, standard crit of 5. To himself, he applies Immobilize for 3 turns, and against the enemy, it also applies Immobilize and Daze. When upgraded, the damage goes up to a range of 3 to 5, and it applies a combo token to the enemy that you hit. It's fairly underwhelming, but its ability to combo once upgraded is noteworthy, I suppose. But I'd argue in most cases it's not worth it, as Leper is far too slow to reliably be a character that combos for someone else, assuming you want to get a combo move off on turn 1. Also, Leper benefits so much from combos himself with using Chop that I'd argue he's not really a great character to use for applying combo tokens, but you could do it if you want to. The ability that it has as well to immobilize himself is good to prevent shuffling, but immobilizing and dazing an enemy is not too useful. There is the sacrificial cultist that you could immobilize if he makes it up to rank 2 to prevent him from going up, but besides that, it just doesn't seem worth the ability slot to use this. I should probably play around with it a bit more, but I don't really find it to be worth using. With his abilities being covered, let's take a look at the synergies Leper has with the other classes. Starting with Plague Doctor, one of the best things I find between the two of them is Magnesium Rain being able to clear tokens, especially in the cultist fight, as all 4 of them start with dodge tokens. This can effectively shred all of them, allowing Leper to get to chopping. Also, Emboldening Vapors is great, as strength tokens are 50% increased damage, and as its percentage base, Leper's high base damage off chop benefits from this quite a bit. Also worth noting, as healing is percentage based with Leper's high health pool, it will give him quite a bit of healing relative to how much other characters would heal for. Indiscriminate Science can also be quite useful to remove blind from him if he happens to get low, but this isn't a sure way of removing blind, as if his health is higher than half, you won't be able to use it. Moving on to Grave Robber. Not a whole lot of natural synergy between these characters, except rank 2 Pirouette can remove tokens from the front enemies, like dodge or block, allowing him to hit, as well as, more importantly, I'd argue, her ability to remove corpses means that Leper, without having much reach, as he can't really deal damage past the front 2 ranks, it makes sure that there's always an enemy available for him to deal damage to. Moving on to Highwayman. Due to the fact that generally Leper is going to be tanking, it can be kind of awkward if you want to open with Duelist Advance, as Leper will be tanking hits, so you won't be able to get as much value out of Riposte. One way that I found to, instead of relying on that, having better synergy, is you put Highwayman in rank 1 to start, opening with Point Blank Shot, as it applies combo, moving him back to rank 2, and then Leper being shuffled up, and then being able to immediately chop that target for a lot of damage with just 2 abilities. Obviously, assuming you have a way to cleanse his blind, or you have chop upgraded. Moving on to Man-at-Arms. One word, and that's command. It removes blind, great for Leper, as he blinds himself a lot, as we know, and also it gives him a strength token as well, working great with his damage, as mentioned previously in Plague Doctor. If you bring Man-at-Arms with Leper, this is likely what you will want to be using quite a bit, assuming you want Leper to be your damage carry. Hellion, nothing really to say here. You shouldn't run Hellion with Leper, I'd argue, as both of them have a lot of abilities where you want to be in rank 1, that being Iron Swan, and of course Bleed Out, so I'd just say no situation where you run these 2 together. Runaway, Smokescreen, once upgraded, is amazing, also with Leper's upgraded chop, as it applies a combo token and a vulnerable token once Smokescreen gets upgraded, meaning that Leper can hit for a whole lot of damage. This is one of the best ways to make Leper get those massive, like 80 damage crits, is you get him a strength token, and then Smokescreen applies a vulnerable. The combo means that he can hit, and then you fish for massive crits. Also, Cauterize is quite useful, as with Leper's low bleed resist, as we looked at earlier. This is a consistent way to heal him for quite a bit. Moving on to Jester, one of my favorite things here is Encore, as because Jester has such a higher speed than Leper, this is a way to effectively cheat Leper's turn to get it a lot earlier, as Leper has a slow speed and Jester has a fairly high speed. As Encore gives the target an extra action immediately, Leper can go before a lot of enemies as a way to withstand or potentially even dealing some damage right off the bat. Also, as Jester's damaging abilities apply, at least a lot of his abilities will apply combo tokens, it can be a reliable way to get the Leper hitting. With Occultist, the main thing is Daemon's Pull. As this move applies a combo token without even being upgraded, this is a way where you can reliably, if you take him with Leper, Leper can get the Chop upgrade right away at the first in, as then you can benefit from hitting the enemy with the combo token and ignoring his blind. Daemon's Pull also pulls back rank enemies to the front, which is where Leper wants to hit them, as well as clearing corpses, which is also in the same sense useful for making sure that Leper always has a target. As far as some comps that I'd recommend with Leper, obviously you're pretty much always going to want to have Leper in rank 1. Oftentimes rank 2 could be something like Runaway with Smokescreen, or even Man-at-Arms to provide command. Occultist generally can be further back in the ranks too to get the combo token off, or Jester. Generally rank 4 I like to run Plague Doctor, shredding tokens and generally just providing stuff to the team. So a team comp might look like Leper in the front, Runaway, Jester and Plague Doctor, or maybe something like Highwayman in the front, then Leper, and then you could have like Man-at-Arms and Jester, something like that. Generally, I find that comps are useful when you build around Leper if you want him to deal damage, and if he is tanking, you might want somebody like Highwayman in the back that can provide consistent damage if Leper isn't able to chop too often. With all of that being looked at, I'd say we have a pretty good idea now of how we want to equip Leper in terms of trinkets and items, as well as what kind of mastery upgrades we're going to be wanting to look for. As far as trinkets are concerned, a few things to note. Max HP, because it is so high on him, you get the most bang for your buck when you're giving him HP trinkets. Damage trinkets will be generally stronger on him late game, or once you can get Chop reliably going if you have him as your main damage dealer. But, however, this generally will occur during some of the later ends, you'll want to focus or prioritize your damage trinkets on other mid to back rank damage carries, such as Highwayman, Grave Robber, or Occultist if you decide to go damage with him, as they'll generally benefit from the damage trinkets earlier. Things like the DOT resist, Bleed, Blight, and Burn are quite good on Leper, as he has fairly low resists already, even though Withstand does help with that. And most importantly, I'd argue Move Resist and Stun Resist. Move Resist, as because it is so important to keep him in rank 1 so that he has access to all of his abilities, you don't want him to get shuffled out of position. Stun Resist, generally better the later into the game you get, as of now the final boss does lots and lots of stuns, and if you are doing things like in Revenge or Ruin to kill those bosses, you really don't want him to be stunned so that he can make the most out of every single turn. As far as items, priority obviously Milk-Soaked Linen. If you can buy this, you pretty much always want to, and you want to have this to be the item that you have on Leper, as it clears his blind tokens, which is his biggest downside. This completely alleviates that. And even in other cases when he isn't blinded, you can clear it off your teammates too. Noisemaker is another favorite of mine. As Leper is a tank first and damage dealer second, this helps him tank, as it gives, I believe, 2 taunt tokens and a block token. Worth noting that by placing this item on a faster party member, such as someone like Grave Robber or like Jester, you are able to have Leper tanking quicker, as they'll go first, put Noisemaker on Leper, and then he can start tanking right away before even using something like Intimidate or Withstand. Another thing to note also is that items that deal damage, such as Caltrops, will eat up blind tokens, as they also eat up things like crit tokens and damage tokens. So that's another secondary way, if you don't have Milk Soak Linen or a good buff, in order to get rid of his blind token, eating it up with the item first and then doing something like Chop afterwards. As far as Mastery priority, the obvious first upgrade you'll generally, at least that you think you'd want to get on him, is Chop, and in a lot of cases this is true, but not necessarily at the first in, unless of course you have an occultist with Daemon's Pull, as most times I'd argue the priority will go to something like Inspiring Tune on Jester, or even something like Smokescreen on Runaway, at which point you won't be able to also upgrade Chop. Obviously, you want to upgrade Chop generally as soon as you can, once you have somebody else that can get down combo tokens. Besides that, Withstand is a good upgrade to get those block tokens up. Solemnity's great for the extra amount of stress heal. Intimidate, I would almost never upgrade because not enough enemies right now have stealth, nor Purge or Bash, because I'm not really looking for having him deal combo himself. Considering what we talked about earlier, I'll generally never upgrade Hew or Break, as Chop essentially has too much conflict. It competes with those two. You could upgrade Break and use it instead of Chop if you want to take go into the Tangle, and you could try with that. You'll get some use out of that if you don't necessarily have better ways to shred off the tokens. Besides that, I'd never generally upgrade Reflection, as I think Solemnity is just better in that case. And then Revenger Ruin could be a decent last upgrade right before you go into the boss fight. Otherwise, Leper doesn't generally need a whole lot of upgrades. Generally, just Chop is all you really need on him, and then other things like Withstand, Solemnity, Ruin, or Revenge are things you'll do later once you want to give him a bit of a push. That being said, starting abilities usually will be Chop, Withstand, Solemnity, Reflection for those edge cases, and Intimidate. This is almost always what I will be running on him. If I want to do something funny with like a first upgrade on Break, I'll switch over to that for the Tangle. Even then, I'll generally remove Reflection and run Chop with Break, just in case you want to fight the Layer boss who doesn't have block tokens, so that you can use Chop for more damage. I will then grab like Revenge or Ruin for the final boss, removing Reflection as that's the first thing to drop. Purge if I am in the feeder and I want to deal with corpses. But generally how it will look is always Chop, Withstand, Solemnity, and Intimidate as your main core 4, and then you pick a 5th ability to sort of flex for whatever you need. And that'll about do it for this overview/guide. I hope you all enjoyed and found this useful. Let me know what you think, especially if you disagree. With that being said, good luck on your future runs, and take care.